What is going on, YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to talk about my proposal for a 25-team SEC mega conference. So this conference would probably not ever happen, and if it were to ever happen, it would probably be very far in the future, as a lot of the rights for media and conference contracts extend through the 2030s, and so this was just hypothetical and something that I just came up with in free time. But we will just get into this here, I guess, and this is the rules of it so far, and then we'll get into the teams and where they'll all play. So, as I mentioned earlier, the first detail about this super conference is that there would be 25 teams in the conference, and each team is in a 5-team pod. So each team will play all 4 other teams that are in their pod every year. So Tennessee is in a pod with Vanderbilt, so Tennessee will still play Vanderbilt every year because Vanderbilt is in their pod. Also, though, sticking with Tennessee, I guess, the Vols would play one team from every other pod per year. So with there being 5 pods and 5 teams in each pod, they would be on a cycle of playing one team from each pod every year. And so, in theory, Tennessee, if they played North Carolina, who is in the East pod, as you'll see later, they would play Carolina one year, and then play the other 4 teams in the pods the following 4, and then be back on the rotation of playing North Carolina in that 6th year. So moving on now to the conference championship, the teams that would play in it, it's still just simply the 2 teams within the mega conference that have the best record. But a problem that would be run into often would probably be the situation with ties in record. So what I decided to do would say that Oklahoma and Georgia and Alabama all have the same record. If Alabama beat Georgia, Georgia would not go to the conference championship, and it would be the Tide and the Sooners. And last but not least, in terms of schedule, every team would play 4 out-of-conference games per year. So now, I guess without delaying it anymore, we can get into what teams are in what pod and where they are located. And yeah, I hope you guys will enjoy this, and maybe someday this will become a reality. I don't know. Lord willing it will, but this was just fun to make, and I hope that this might make any bit of sense to you. So now we will hop into each of the pods and who's in what pod. So we'll start off on the left side of the screen. So the SEC West, as I'm calling it, has 5 teams, as mentioned earlier, and these teams are Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, Baylor, Texas, and Texas A&M. So Baylor and Oklahoma State and OU plus Texas are currently all located in the Big 12. Texas and Oklahoma have already agreed to move to the SEC in the future, but Baylor and Oklahoma State would be stolen to add some of these teams, and then Texas A&M already being in the SEC rounds out the SEC West 5. So one question that you might be asking with this whole thing that wasn't mentioned earlier is about rivalries, and would any of those be destroyed or created? And the answer is yes to both. So you keep Oklahoma versus Texas Red River rivalry, you keep Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State, but then you create some new ones in Texas versus Texas A&M, or maybe Oklahoma State versus A&M or Baylor. that really helps generate some more competition within the pod and getting to know these teams more. So now we will move on just to the right. It's the purple outlined group, and this is what I'm calling the SEC Central. It contains Missouri, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and LSU. And this is probably the pod that I like the least, as it's very spread out and there aren't that many rivalries within it. However, to make this work, this seemed like the best way to do it. And so with these teams, in terms of the conferences that they're in all right now, they all come from the SEC. And then in terms of rivalries, I don't know much about this group of teams, as most all of them, 4 out of 5, are in the SEC West, and I'm a Tennessee fan, so I don't really know much about these teams, but at least you can keep the Egg Bowl with Ole Miss and Mississippi State, and then, maybe form rivalries with LSU, and then bring a team like Missouri in, who doesn't play these teams every year, could help just spark some more competition within this pod. So now we'll move on to the top of the screen and the yellow group. This is what I'm calling the SEC North, and it contains Vanderbilt, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Louisville. So I stole one team from the Big 12 in West Virginia, who, I don't really know what they're doing in the Big 12 right now, but we stole them anyway. And then Louisville from the ACC has been taken to join the SEC North. So this pod is pretty good, as you have Louisville and Kentucky, which is already sort of a rivalry. And then you have Tennessee versus Vandy, Tennessee versus Kentucky. And then I do think that West Virginia could add in some competition with Kentucky or Tennessee. And then Vanderbilt is just kind of on its own as a football program. Sorry, Vanderbilt fans, but I just don't know where your rivalry is outside of Tennessee. So now moving straight down to the green group. This is what I'm calling the SEC South, and it contains Alabama, Auburn, Florida State, Florida, and Miami. So 3 SEC teams and 2 current ACC teams that we've stolen. And this is probably one of the best divisions, if not the best, because it contains 3 schools that are fairly competitive every year in Alabama, Auburn, and Florida from the SEC. And then surely Florida State or Miami will show something good from the ACC. And this is also a really rich conference in terms of rivalries, as you keep the Iron Bowl, which, could be considered one of the best rivalries in all of sports. And then you also have Florida State versus Florida, Florida, Alabama. You create Florida versus Miami, maybe. All sorts of fun rivalries that, anybody would probably turn on their TV on a Saturday and be happy to see any of these 2 teams playing each other. So now the final pod is the pink one. This is what I'm calling the SEC East. And it is filled with Georgia, Clemson, South Carolina, North Carolina, and North Carolina State. And this pod is, at least right now, if they all played together, would be stacked. Georgia, coming off a national championship, they're really good. Clemson, not that far removed from having playoff runs almost every year. They're still a team that is bound to be ranked a lot this season. And then NC State has kind of snuck up on us as a good team, as well as North Carolina, who could do some damage over there in the ACC, even after losing their starting quarterback. And then South Carolina has not been a bad team necessarily. They haven't been good in recent years, but we can throw in them just to make the conference all balanced. But in terms of rivalries, this conference is great. Excuse me, I said conference. I meant to say pods, but this is really good. I mean, you have Georgia versus Clemson, which could be really, really nice. We saw them play earlier in last season, I believe. You already have Clemson versus South Carolina. You have North Carolina versus NC State. And then you have South Carolina, who played North Carolina in a bowl game, I believe, this year. And then Clemson versus South Carolina, which happens every year, is always a good one to see. So, in conclusion, I guess, for this conference, in terms of the pods, I think that this could work. I think it's competitive, and some of the conferences have some really good teams, but I don't think there's any conference that is really just super bad. And so I think any team in this whole entire mega conference could be anybody else they play on a given Saturday or whatever day that they might play. I think this is a really cool new kind of modern way with all the expansion going on. If the SEC wanted to try and hit a grand slam and just absolutely blow the Big Ten, the Big 12 out of the water and try and, bring in the next wave of college football expansion. But I don't think that this would probably ever happen in real life. But, if it did happen, I would like it, I think. Let me know what you would think of it in the comments below. But, yeah, this is my proposal for a 25-team SEC Mega Conference. If you don't like it, that's completely fine. I understand why. But I thought it would just be cool to try and come up with something. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.